There's all these excuses that people come up with for getting involved in the war, but the really big driving factor for everybody is imperialism, is stuff, and is being the biggest player on the world stage at the end of it. We spend a lot of time thinking about the causes of the First World War, and we have a big list of long and short-term causes that made it inevitable in the end. We've also established over the last 100 years really definite ideas about who we think was to blame. But today, I'm going to throw all of that out the window and tell you that really there's only one cause that matters in the end, and one main thing that everybody hoped to get out of being involved. I'm also going to prove that because of this, nobody's hands were clean when it came to putting out blame for who was responsible. If we're looking at the First World War, we have two kinds of causes. We have long-term causes and we have short-term causes. When we look at the long-term causes of the First World War, one of the important ones is alliances. So the reason that so many countries became involved in 1914 is because they were all tied to other countries. They had friend groups, if you like, that made it kind of essential that they declare war and stick with their buddies. So you have the two important ones are the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and it should be Italy as well. And then you have the Triple Entente, which is Britain, France and Russia. Now, first of all, France made friends with Russia. And then in about 1904, it's a really big deal because don't forget, we've spent about 1,000 years at this point fighting wars against the French, but Britain decided to be friends with France. And this one was a game changer because it made Germany feel surrounded, because all of these friends are on different sides of Europe and at different points. And Germany feels like it's stuck in the middle with no way out. This leads to another one of our long-term causes, which is militarism. By this, we mean that countries became kind of obsessed with making sure that they had the biggest army they possibly could. And in some aspects, they're concerned with having a bigger army than their neighbour. And the two major players in this are Germany and Russia. Germany are utterly paranoid because they think they're surrounded by the Triple Entente. But also as well, Russia is massive. It covers 1/6 of the planet. And they have this infinite reserve of manpower. And so Germany are really, really hung up on making their army as powerful as possible. By 1914, Germany can put 4 million men into the field in their army. France can also put 4 million men into battle. But remember that France are friends with Russia, and Russia still are this massive problem on the eastern side of Germany because they can put 6 million men into uniform. So Germany, once again, feeling utterly surrounded and obsessed with making their army as powerful as possible. You also have a similar thing happening at sea, and we call this the naval arms race. Britain dominated the seas and had done ever since the beginning of the 19th century. And in the 1880s, Britain comes up with this thing called a two-power standard, which means that Britain is obsessed with maintaining a navy that is superior to the next two navies in the world combined. And what you have from the 1890s and the early 1900s is Britain and Germany, who don't really have a navy to speak of until Kaiser Wilhelm II comes to the throne, and he's obsessed with having a great navy. Partly because he admires Britain. Don't forget that he's Queen Victoria's grandson, and he wants to do the navy the British way. They have this race to see who can build the biggest, best ships, and it centres around something called a dreadnought, which is a new, shiny kind of ship that the British start making in 1906. By 1914, Germany have lost the naval arms race, which means that as well as feeling surrounded on land, they also know that Britain's navy is superior to their own, and that in a pitched battle of the biggest navy versus their navy, they will not win. So all of these long-term causes have left a simmering resentment in Europe between the different groups. And then we come to the short-term causes. And really what I want to talk about is the last straw. We call it the catalyst for the beginning of the First World War. And that's the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. On the 28th of June 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian-born Serb called Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's a miracle he pulled it off, because he and his friends were grossly incompetent, and really it was just utterly bad luck, a combination of bad luck and also incompetence on the part of the security services that were supposed to be looking after him. But he was assassinated in Sarajevo, and this caused an international incident, because Austria-Hungary is already obsessed with the idea that Serbia would try and ruin its empire. Austria-Hungary is made up of what we now regard as like 30-odd nations, and it's a mix of different ethnicities and nationalities and religions, and by 1914 it's a mess. And one of their biggest bugbears is Serbia, because Serbia is this new country, and also as well there are lots of Serbs still on the wrong side of the border, if you like, and they're agitating, and Princip is one of these. They don't want to be part of this empire anymore. And what Austria-Hungary does is seize the assassination as an excuse to put them in their place. Now, they're not trying to start a world war. They think this is going to be yet another localised little war down in their corner of the Balkans, and that they'll quickly deal with Serbia and get rid of the problem. Austria-Hungary sends a list of demands to Serbia, and as a document, an international diplomacy document, the list is obscene. And yet Serbia agrees to most of it, because Serbia doesn't want another war. There have been multiple wars, Balkan wars, in the years approaching 1914, and Serbia remarkably almost rolls over completely. But the length of time that it takes for all this to happen starts to unnerve the entire situation. And one of the big things that's blamed for the war is the fact that Germany says to Austria-Hungary, well, do whatever you're going to do and we'll support you. And we call this the blank check. And this is a massive mistake, because it makes Austria-Hungary a lot braver than it maybe would have been when it's making these demands, because they think that whatever they do and however over the top their response is, that Germany will back them up. And this turns out to be a really big error on the part of Germany. And what you have is a domino effect. So we know that Germany sided with Austria, but then Russia sided with Serbia. And that means France obviously have their entente with Russia, so they're going to side with them. And then the big outlier is that Germany decide that in order to defeat France, they're going to march through Belgium. Belgium is a neutral country, and their neutrality is assured by international law. So Germany are breaking the law by setting foot there. And then that's the excuse that Britain uses to get involved as well. So you have this domino effect of countries which basically make this go from what would have been, and I think what Austria intended to be another small war in that corner of Europe, into being a massive problem. So let's look at the players. In terms of the great powers in Europe leading up to the First World War, it really helps if you look at them like they're people. So if we look at the elderly people in the room, we have Austria-Hungary, we have Russia, and we have Turkey as well. So these are three massive empires, but they are still doing things the old-fashioned way, and they're very much out of date, and they've kind of been left behind. So they are struggling to maintain their place in the world because they're old and falling apart, basically. Then you have the mature adults. Now, I would put Britain and France in this category. So Britain and France are the dominant imperial powers. They have the biggest empires. They're kind of the most stable. They like the status quo. They're not falling apart, but yet they have established themselves in the world, and they have the most to show for it. And then you have what I'll refer to as the teenagers. And in this group, you've got Germany, importantly, but you've also got Italy as well. So both of these countries were only about 50 years old when the First World War started. Before that, they were lots of smaller countries. So they've missed the boat. They don't have what Britain and France and still the elderly powers have at this point. And they want it. They want to make their way in the world. They want to establish themselves. They're anxious about it, and potentially over the top about how they're going to achieve achieve it. So Germany especially want a far-flung empire, and Italy have what we call irredentism, which is Italy has formed in the 1860s, but Italy still thinks it's unfinished. There are still bits that belong at that point to the Austro-Hungarian army that they believe should be Italy. They believe that it's full of Italians and that they are incomplete until they get it. So these are the players, and now we need to talk about the game. The big long list of causes, long and short term, are important, but really the only cause that matters when we talk about the outbreak of the First World War is imperialism. Everything they do revolves around stuff. It's stuff they want, stuff people already have that they'd like to take, and stuff they're afraid of losing. And this is what drives everybody to become involved in the First World War. People make excuses about how they got involved. So Britain's excuse for getting involved in the First World War is that they're protecting poor little Belgium, and they're protecting the fact that Germany have broken international law by invading Belgium. That's not really why Britain goes to war. Britain goes to war because you can't not go to war. If you are an established imperial power, a world war is going to rock the status quo. It's going to change who has what, because there will be winners and there will be losers. And what people were trying to do was absolutely make sure that they had a seat at the table when it came to dividing up who got what at the end. You couldn't afford, if you were a major imperial power, not to have a seat at the table at the end. And really that's the excuse. Russia say they're going to war for the Slavs to protect poor little Serbia, but there's a brilliant expose written by a Polish man who's living in Switzerland at the time that says, well, hang on a minute, you're protecting those Slavs who aren't part of your empire, but my Slavs are, and you treat us like dirt. So there's all these excuses that people come up with for getting involved in the war, but the really big driving factor for everybody is imperialism, is stuff, and is being the biggest player on the world stage at the end of it. The sad thing about all of this is that Franz Ferdinand, the man who had been assassinated, might have been the one person that could have stopped these dominoes falling in 1914. For a start, he understood that Austria-Hungary's position was out of date and that it needed to change its approach if it wanted to survive. He had lots of ideas for this. His uncle was really old by this point, and he knew that he was going to succeed him sooner rather than later. Now, the Emperor Franz Joseph jealously guarded his power, but the one thing he let Franz Ferdinand really get involved in was military affairs. Since 1898, he'd had his whole own office for doing this, and he had made himself a real player when it came to deciding what the Austro-Hungarian army was going to do. He'd also proven 2 or 3 times that he was a really strong advocate for peace. So you have to ask yourself, if he had been alive when the July crisis started and his assassination hadn't been the cause of it, he could really have been the one in the room, like counselling calmness and restraint where there was none eventually. Which leads us to talking about the blame for the First World War. Now, based on the fact that everybody was obsessed with how much stuff they could get out of it, I don't think that there's any one nation that's really to blame. I think if you were going to apportion more blame to one country, it should probably be Austria-Hungary for issuing those demands to Serbia in the first place. The Kaiser has 2 cousins who also sit on thrones that are important. One is George V in Britain and one is Nicholas II in Russia. And a lot gets said about what these cousins might have done to prevent the war. But really, when push came to shove in 1914, none of them had enough power to stop their politicians and stop their armies from going to war. Least of all George V, who was a constitutional monarch. In Britain, the monarch doesn't rule, they reign, which means that they don't get to decide what happens. They can, at best, influence and advise, which is what George V tried to do. In theory, Wilhelm was in charge of both the army and the politicians in Germany, but as July went on, he has less and less sway and events start running away from him. And even Nicholas, who's supposed to be an autocrat, from about 1905, he really hasn't had the kind of power that he was accustomed to. He signed a lot of it away. And so what you have is these 3 cousins, eventually all 3 of them, trying hard to maintain peace, but really lacking the kind of influence and power they would have needed to dictate what their politicians do. Thank you for watching. Next time we're going to be looking at neutrality. We're going to look at what it takes to stay out of a war and how by 1914 it was basically impossible.